Sometimes the biggest hearts come in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes love finds us in the darkest moments when we think we're beyond saving. In the dusty frontier town of Bellwater, 1875, townsfolk gather to auction off Benjamin Thunder Garrett, a giant cowboy shackled for crimes no one can name. The crowd mocks his size and silence until Miss Abigail Stone, a lonely schoolteacher, steps forward. She sees something others missed, a gentle soul hiding behind his strength. What starts as buying a ranch hand becomes something deeper as they rebuild a broken homestead and heal their wounded hearts. But when his past rides into town with guns drawn, she must choose between safety and love. What happens when a woman's compassion meets a man's buried shame? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bellwater as Abigail Stone adjusted the chain around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of her late husband's wedding ring against her chest. 23 years old when she'd married Thomas, 41 now, and still wearing black dresses that had faded to charcoal grey. The ring was all she had left of their brief, sweet marriage, cut short by consumption before they could fill their little house with the children they'd dreamed of. She walked with measured steps toward the one-room schoolhouse, her worn leather satchel filled with primers and slates, her mind already organizing the day's lessons. The children of Bellwater were good souls, mostly, though some carried the rough edges of their frontier upbringing. There was young Timothy Fletcher, whose father ran the general store, bright as a new penny, but prone to daydreaming about adventures. Beyond the town's borders, little Margaret O'Sullivan, whose Irish accent still colored her English despite 3 years in America, struggled with her letters, but had a gift for numbers that amazed even Abigail. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a modest building with whitewashed walls that Abigail scrubbed clean every Saturday. Inside, she'd arranged the desks in neat rows, each one bearing the scratches and ink stains of countless young minds. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows she'd insisted on when the town built the school. Children needed light to learn. Properly, she'd argued, and the school board had eventually agreed, though they'd grumbled about the extra expense. As she arranged her teaching materials, Abigail's thoughts drifted to the empty house waiting for her at day's end. Thomas had built it with his own hands during their brief engagement, every board and nail placed with love and hope for their future. Now it felt too large for one person, too quiet, too full of memories that both comforted and haunted her. She'd kept it exactly as it was, the day he died. His coffee cup still on the kitchen table, his clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, his books still open to the pages he'd been reading. The sound of children's voices brought her back to the present. They came in groups of 2 and 3, some walking from the closer homesteads, others arriving in wagons driven by parents who lived further out. Each child brought news from home. Mrs. Patterson's cow had given birth to twins. The Murphy family's eldest son was talking about heading to California. Old Henrik Larson had struck water on his land after months of digging. "Good morning, Miss Stone," they chorused, taking their seats with the easy familiarity of a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Good morning, children," Abigail replied, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came from years of teaching. "Before we begin our lessons, I want to share something with you. Today, our town will witness something unusual. There's to be an auction." Young Timothy's hand shot up. "Ma says they're selling a man, Miss Stone." "How can someone sell a person?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the complexity of frontier justice and the harsh realities of life in 1875. Abigail had wrestled with the same question since hearing about Benjamin Garrett's situation. He'd been brought to town 3 weeks ago, accused of crimes no one seemed able to clearly define. The sheriff, a decent man named Morrison, had looked troubled when he'd locked the giant cowboy in the town's small jail. "It's not slavery, Timothy," Abigail explained carefully. Mr. Garrett owes a debt to society, and he'll work to pay it off. Someone will buy his contract, and he'll work for them until his debt is satisfied. But even as she said the words, they tasted bitter in her mouth. She'd seen Benjamin Garrett through the jailhouse window, a mountain of a man with shoulders broad as a barn door, but with eyes that held a sadness deeper than any well. The townspeople whispered about him in hushed tones, some claiming he was a killer, others saying he was touched in the head. Nobody seemed to know the truth, but everyone had an opinion. After dismissing the children for their midday meal, Abigail found herself walking toward the center of town, where a crowd was already gathering. The auction block had been set up in front of Murphy's saloon, a raised platform that usually hosted traveling preachers or the occasional politician passing through. Today it would hold a different kind of spectacle. She recognized most of the faces in the growing crowd. There was Dr. Henley, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who served as the town's physician and unofficial voice of reason. Mrs. Fletcher stood near the front, her sharp eyes already evaluating Benjamin Garrett like he was livestock at market. Behind her, a cluster of ranch hands from the various spreads outside town muttered among themselves, their interest purely practical. They were always in need of strong backs for hard work. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the jailhouse, his weathered face grim as he escorted Benjamin Garrett toward the platform. The crowd fell silent as they got their first good look at the man. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to strain the fabric of his worn shirt. His dark hair hung past his collar, and several days' growth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught Abigail's attention, pale, blue like a winter sky, filled with a resignation that spoke of a man who'd given up hoping for kindness from the world. Heavy iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles, the metal dark with rust and wear. He moved with the careful, measured steps of someone who'd learned to accommodate the weight of chains. When he reached the platform, he stood straight-backed, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if he could will himself to be anywhere but here. The auctioneer, a portly man named Dickens who traveled the circuit between towns, cleared his throat and began his practiced spiel. "Ladies and gentlemen, before you stands Benjamin Garrett, known in some parts as Thunder, for reasons I'm sure you can imagine. He's strong as an ox, experienced with horses and cattle, and in need of honest work to pay his debt to society." Someone in the crowd shouted, "What did he do?" And others took up the cry, demanding details of his alleged crimes. Dickens held up his hands for quiet. "The specifics ain't my concern, folks. What matters is he's got strong hands and a willing spirit. We'll start the bidding at $50. Abigail watched as various men called out bids, each one evaluating Benjamin like a piece of equipment. She saw something in his face, a flicker of pain when someone referred to him as that big ox or the giant dummy. He wasn't stupid, she realized. He understood every word, felt every slight, carried every insult like a weight on his already burdened soul. The bidding climbed slowly. Ranchers saw the value in his obvious strength, but $50 was real money, not to be spent lightly. At $75, only 2 bidders remained, Jake Morrison, who ran cattle on a spread north of town, and Cyrus Webb, whose reputation for working his hired men to the bone was well known. $80, Webb called out, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who smelled victory. Jake Morrison shook his head and stepped back. $80 was too much for him to risk on an unknown quantity. "Going once," Dickens announced, raising his gavel. Something stirred in Abigail's chest, a memory of Thomas's gentle hands, the way he'd always seen goodness in people others had given up on. She thought of her empty house, the abandoned homestead she'd inherited from her aunt, and the way this giant of a man stood so still and quiet, bearing his humiliation with a dignity that broke her heart. "85, she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. Every head turned toward her. She felt their stares, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Fletcher. saw Dr. Henley's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. But she kept her gaze fixed on Benjamin Garrett, and for the first time since he'd stepped onto that platform, his eyes met hers. What she saw there almost made her step back. Pain, yes, but also surprise, and something that might have been hope. Carefully guarded, but unmistakably present. In that moment she knew she was doing more than buying a worker. She was taking responsibility for another human being's future, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a warm shawl on a cold morning. "Any other bids?" Dickens asked, clearly surprised by this unexpected turn. Cyrus Webb scowled and raised his hand. 90. 100, Abigail said without hesitation, her teacher's savings representing every penny she'd carefully hoarded over the years. Webb cursed under his breath and shook his head. $100 was more than he was willing to spend on. Any hired hand, no matter how strong, sold to Miss Stone for $100, Dickens announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation and speculation. Abigail made her way through the groups of people, some nodding respectfully, others giving her looks that ranged from puzzled to disapproving. She reached the platform just as Sheriff Morrison was preparing to transfer custody. "Miss Stone," the sheriff said quietly, his voice carrying concern. "You sure about this? He's a big man, and we don't know much about his past." "I'm sure," Abigail replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she counted out the bills from her reticule. Benjamin Garrett looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his shirt was mended but clean, the careful way he held himself to avoid crowding her with his size. He was probably in his 30s, she guessed, though hard living might have aged him beyond his years. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep but surprisingly gentle, "I want you to know, I'll work hard for you. Whatever you need done, I'll do it right." The simple dignity in his words, the careful respect in his tone, confirmed what her instincts had told her. This was not a dangerous man. This was a man who'd been broken by circumstances beyond his control, and who still possessed enough honor to make promises he intended to keep. As Sheriff Morrison unlocked the shackles from Benjamin's ankles, Abigail found herself wondering what she'd gotten herself into. She had a homestead that needed work, that was true, but she'd just spent her life savings on a man whose past was a mystery and whose future was now her responsibility. The iron shackles fell away with a dull clank, and Benjamin Garrett was a free man, bound now not by metal but by debt and contract, and perhaps, Abigail hoped, by the possibility of finding something in this small frontier town that he'd lost somewhere along the way. The ride to the homestead passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of Abigail's mare, Patience. Benjamin sat in the wagon bed, his large frame making the small conveyance seem even more modest than it was. Abigail had offered him the seat beside her, but he'd declined with a polite shake of his head, settling himself among her teaching supplies and the few provisions she'd hastily gathered from the general store. She stole glances at him as they left Bellwater behind, following the rutted dirt road that led to her aunt's old place. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes scanning the horizon with the automatic alertness of a man accustomed to trouble. There was something almost military in his posture, she thought, a discipline that spoke of training and experience beyond simple ranch work. "It's about 3 miles, she said, trying to break the tension. "The homestead, I mean. My aunt left it to me when she passed 2 years ago." "Yes, ma'am," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying no expectation of conversation. The formal politeness stung a little. She'd hoped, what had she hoped? That he'd be grateful enough to open up to her immediately, that purchasing his contract would somehow bridge the vast gulf between their circumstances. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to settle. In her mind, like dust after a windstorm, coating everything with uncomfortable questions. What would people say when word spread through town? Mrs. Fletcher would have plenty to whisper about over her morning coffee, and the other ladies of the church auxiliary would find ways to express their concerns with carefully chosen words and meaningful looks. A single woman taking on a hired man was questionable enough. Taking on a man of Benjamin's size and mysterious past was downright scandalous. The homestead came into view as they crested a small hill, and Abigail felt her heart sink at the sight. It looked even more dilapidated than she remembered. The main house sagged on one corner where the foundation had shifted, and several boards had fallen from the porch. The barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof sporting gaps that let in both weather and wildlife. Weeds had claimed what had once been her aunt's vegetable garden, and the fence that had enclosed the small pasture lay in broken sections. She pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake, her hands trembling slightly. In her mind, she'd pictured this moment differently, herself confidently showing Benjamin around the property, explaining what needed to be done, establishing the boundaries of their working relationship. Instead, she felt overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the work ahead and uncertain how to begin. Benjamin climbed down from the wagon with careful movements, his boots raising small clouds of dust when they hit the ground. He stood for a moment, taking in the state of the buildings with the practiced eye of someone who understood construction and repair work. "How long since anyone lived here?" he asked, walking toward the house with measured steps. 3 years, maybe 4, Abigail admitted, climbing down from her seat and smoothing her dark skirts. "My aunt was getting too old to manage it, and after she moved to town, nobody wanted to take on the work it would need." Benjamin nodded, testing the stability of the porch steps before putting his full weight on them. The boards held, though. They creaked ominously. He examined the doorframe, running his fingers along the wood where it had warped slightly, then peered through one of the grimy windows. "Foundations settled on the south corner," he observed, his voice taking on a different quality, more confident, less deferential. "But the bones of the house are solid. This is good timber built to last. With some work, she'll be sound again." Abigail felt a spark of hope at his assessment. She'd feared the property might be beyond saving, that she'd made a terrible mistake in bringing him here. But Benjamin moved around the buildings like a man who understood what he was looking at, testing support beams, examining joints, evaluating what could be repaired and what would need to be replaced. "The barn's in rougher shape," he continued, pushing open the sagging door. "But the main structure's still good. Need new boards for the roof, some bracing on this side, new hinges for the doors." He turned to look at her, and for the first time since the auction, she saw something other than resigned politeness in his expression. There was interest there, perhaps even enthusiasm, as if the prospect of useful work had awakened something in him that had been sleeping. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what are you planning to do with this place?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on the immediate problem of what to do with Benjamin that she hadn't really considered the larger picture. I thought perhaps it could be made livable again. Maybe run a few head of cattle, plant a garden. I have my teaching, of course, but this land shouldn't go to waste." Benjamin nodded slowly. "It's good land. Your aunt chose well when she settled here. There's water." He gestured toward a line of cottonwoods that marked the path of a small creek. "And the soil's rich. With work, this could be a fine little ranch." The way he said it, with genuine respect for the land and what it could become, made Abigail see the property through different eyes. Instead of a burden she'd inherited, it could be a home, a real home. Not just the empty house in town where she existed but didn't truly live. "I have some money saved," she said, pulling the folded homestead deed from her reticule. The worn legal document felt substantial in her hands, tangible proof of possibility. "Not much, but enough for materials. If we're careful. And there's a good well. My aunt always said it never ran dry, even in the worst drought years." Benjamin took the deed when she offered it, handling the paper with careful respect. His eyes moved across the legal language, and Abigail realized, with surprise, that he was actually reading it, not just looking at it. He could read, clearly and well, from the speed with which his eyes tracked the text. 22 acres, he said, handing the deed back to her. That's a good size for what you're thinking. Room for a decent herd, space for crops, enough timber for fuel and repairs. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Ma'am, I want you to know I'm grateful for what you did today. I know it cost you dear, and I know it'll cost you more in talk around town. I mean to earn what you paid, and more besides. The sincerity in his voice, the careful way he acknowledged both her sacrifice and the social consequences she'd face, touched something deep in Abigail's heart. This was not a man who took kindness for granted, or failed to understand the complexities of their situation. There's a small room off the back of the house, she said, her voice steadier now. It was meant to be a hired man's quarters, though my aunt never had need of one. It's got its own entrance, so you'd have privacy. I'll take meals with you. It wouldn't be proper otherwise. But you'd have your own space. Benjamin's relief at this arrangement was visible, though he tried to hide it. The prospect of appropriate boundaries clearly mattered to him as much as it did to her. As they walked through the house together, Abigail found herself seeing it through his eyes as well as her own. The main room was spacious, with a stone fireplace. That would provide good heat in winter. The kitchen was small but well-designed, with a pump handle that would connect to the well once the pipes were repaired. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room, both of modest size but adequate for a family. And family! The thought came unbidden, and Abigail pushed it away quickly. She was hiring Benjamin to restore the property, nothing more. The loneliness that had driven her to make such an impulsive decision at the auction was not a reason to indulge in foolish fantasies. But as she watched Benjamin examine the fireplace, testing the damper and checking the chimney for obstructions, she couldn't help but notice how right he looked in this space, how his presence made the empty house feel less abandoned and more full of potential. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They'd need to head back to town soon. Benjamin would have to stay at the jail until she could make the hired man's quarters habitable, and she needed to return to her own house to prepare for tomorrow's lessons. But for now, standing in the doorway of the old homestead, with this gentle giant of a man beside her, Abigail allowed herself to imagine what the place could become with time and work and care. Maybe she'd made a mistake today, but if so, it was a mistake that felt like hope. 3 days later, Abigail found herself driving the familiar path to the homestead with a wagon full of supplies, lumber from the mill, nails, rope, and basic provisions for the work ahead. Benjamin had spent those 3 days making the hired man's quarters habitable, sleeping on a bedroll Sheriff Morrison had provided, and taking his meals at Murphy's saloon under the watchful eyes of the townspeople. The change in him was remarkable. Gone was the defeated slump of his shoulders from the auction block. Instead, he moved with purpose and quiet confidence, attacking each repair task with methodical precision. By the time she arrived on this crisp October morning, he'd already replaced the broken porch steps and rehung the front door so it no longer scraped against the frame. "Morning, Miss Stone," he called from the roof of the barn, where he was replacing damaged shingles. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle from years of hard work. Despite his size, he moved across the steep roof with surprising grace, each step carefully placed and sure. "Good morning, Benjamin," she replied, setting the brake on her wagon. The casual use of his first name had evolved naturally over the past few days, though he still addressed her with formal respect. "I've brought the lumber you requested, and Mrs. Patterson at the general store sent along some coffee and bacon." Benjamin climbed down from the roof with easy movements, landing lightly despite his bulk. As he approached the wagon, Abigail noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small leather-bound book protruding from his back pocket. When he bent to examine the lumber, the book shifted, and she caught a glimpse of gold lettering on the worn cover. "This is good wood," Benjamin said, running his hand along one of the boards. "Pine's not as pretty as oak, but it'll hold strong and true. Should have enough here to finish the barn roof and start on the house foundation." As he began unloading the wagon, Abigail found her curiosity getting the better of her. "Benjamin, what's that book you carry?" He froze for a moment, his hand instinctively moving to his back pocket. A flush crept up his neck, and she realized she'd touched on something. Private, perhaps embarrassing. "It's nothing, Mom, well, it's a Bible." His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "My mother gave it to me when I left home. I know it's not fitting for a man in my situation to carry such a thing, but—" "Not fitting," Abigail interrupted, genuine surprise in her voice. "Benjamin, why on earth would it not be fitting?" He looked up at her then, confusion replacing the embarrassment in his expression. "Ma'am, I'm a hired man with a questionable past. Most folks would say I got no business reading the good book, especially after—" He stopped abruptly, as if he'd said too much. "Especially after what?" Benjamin shook his head, turning back to the lumber. "Nothing, ma'am, just talking foolish." But Abigail wasn't willing to let it go. She'd spent enough years with children to recognize the signs of someone carrying a burden, too heavy for their shoulders. "Benjamin, may I see it?" Reluctantly, he pulled the Bible from his pocket and handed it to her. The leather cover was soft with age and handling, and the gold letters spelling Holy Bible had been worn nearly smooth by countless touches. When she opened it, she found page after page of careful annotations in the margins, notes written in a clear, educated hand that revealed not just literacy, but deep thought and study. "You wrote all these notes?" she asked, amazed by the scholarship evident in the cramped writing. "Yes, ma'am. Started when I was young. My mother taught me to read from this very book, and I kept thinking about what the words meant, and I'd write down my thoughts." Abigail read some of the marginal notes, finding insights that would have impressed the minister back in Bellwater. This was not the work of a simple ranch hand or a dangerous criminal. This was the mind of an educated man, someone who'd spent years wrestling with questions of faith and morality. "Benjamin, where did you go to school?" "Back in Missouri. Little place called Cedar Ridge. My parents ran the general store there, and they sent me to the academy in Kansas City for 2 years before." Again, he stopped himself, the walls going back up around whatever painful memories he carried. "Before what happened to bring you here?" Abigail said gently. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. She closed the Bible and handed it back to him, making sure their fingers touched as she did. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It tells me more about who you really are than anything the town gossips could whisper." Something shifted in Benjamin's face at her words, a softening around his eyes, a loosening of the tension he carried in his jaw. "You're not like other folks, Miss Stone. Most people, they see a man my size and they think they know everything there is to know about him. And what do they think they know? That I'm simple, that I solve problems with my fists, that books and gentle things aren't for the likes of me." He tucked the Bible carefully back into his pocket. "Sometimes it's easier to let them think that. Saves complications." They worked together that morning, and Abigail found herself fascinated by Benjamin's approach to each task. He planned carefully before beginning, measuring twice and cutting, once never rushing or taking shortcuts. When they stopped for the midday meal she'd packed, he surprised her by asking about her students. "Must be rewarding work, teaching children," he said, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered him. "Seeing young minds grow and learn new things." "It is," she agreed, settling beside him on the newly repaired porch steps. "Though some days I wonder if I'm really reaching them. There's one boy, Tommy Patterson, who's bright as a new penny, but can't seem to sit still long enough to learn his letters properly." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "Sounds like he might learn better with his hands. Some folks, especially boys, they need to build something or fix something while they're learning. Makes the lessons stick better." "How do you know that?" Had a friend like that in school. Teacher thought he was slow, but he was just wired different. When she finally let him carve his letters in wood instead of writing them on a slate, he took to reading like a duck to water. The insight was both practical and compassionate, and Abigail filed it away to try with Tommy. This man continued to surprise her, his gentleness with the injured barn cat that had appeared the second day, his careful attention to even the smallest details of repair work, and now this understanding of how different minds learned differently. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began to take notice of the activity at the old homestead. Abigail saw riders pause on the ridge to the east, clearly, observing the work being done. Word would spread quickly through the community. Miss Stone and her hired man were making real progress on the abandoned place. She found herself wondering what they made of the sight of her working alongside Benjamin, handing him tools and helping to hold boards in place while he nailed them down. It wasn't entirely proper for a lady to engage in such physical labor, but the work felt good, purposeful in a way her solitary life in town never had. When it came time to head back to Bellwater, Benjamin helped her load the empty supply boxes into the wagon with the same careful courtesy he showed in all things. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, and she heard hope in the question. "Same time tomorrow," she confirmed, and was rewarded with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him, a transformation that lit up his weathered features and made her understand why some women might find a man like Benjamin Garrett very appealing indeed. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Abigail arrived at the homestead to find Benjamin standing in the main room of the house, holding something small in his weathered hands. His shoulders were rigid with tension, and she could see the careful control he was exercising over his emotions. "Benjamin, what is it?" He turned toward her, and she was startled to see moisture in his pale blue eyes. In his palm lay a small wooden horse, no bigger than her fist, carved with obvious love and skill. The paint had faded to soft pastels, but she could still make out the details. A flowing mane, tiny reins, even miniature stirrups. "Found it under some old boards in the back room," he said, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to hide. "Some child loved this little fellow once." Abigail moved closer, drawn by the careful way he held the toy. "It's beautiful work, hand-carved by someone who knew what they were doing." Benjamin nodded, turning the horse over to reveal initials carved into the bottom. J.G., 1869. His thumb traced the letters with infinite gentleness. "J.G.," Abigail said softly. "Those are your initials." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Benjamin's jaw worked as he struggled with whatever memory the little horse had awakened. Finally, he sank onto one of the wooden crates they'd been using as makeshift furniture, the toy still cradled in his hands. "I made it for my boy," he said, so quietly she had to strain to hear him. "For his 4th birthday. Jacob, he was named for my grandfather. He loved horses, something fierce, always begging me to take him to see the mustangs that ran through our valley back home." Abigail's heart clenched at the past tense. She settled beside him on another crate, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to crowd him in his grief. "He would have been 7 this past spring," Benjamin continued, his voice growing stronger. As the words came, had his mother's dark hair and her quick laugh, smart as a whip, always asking questions about everything under the sun. "Papa, why is the sky blue? Papa, where do the stars come from?" I tried to answer them all, but sometimes his voice cracked. Sometimes I'd tell him we'd talk about it later, thinking I had all the time in the world. "What happened to him?" Abigail asked gently. Benjamin's hands tightened around the wooden horse. "Fire took them both, Jacob and his mother, my wife Sarah. I was away on a cattle drive, 3 weeks from home, when a neighbor rode out to find me. By the time I got back, he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Oh, Benjamin." Abigail's hand moved instinctively to cover his, offering what comfort she could. "I'm so sorry." "Should have been there," he said, the words coming out in a rush of self-recrimination. "Should have been home protecting them. Instead, I was chasing money, thinking about expanding the ranch, making plans for a future that got burned to ash while I was counting other men's cattle. The raw pain in his voice broke something loose in Abigail's chest. She understood grief, had lived with it since Thomas's death. But this was different. This was guilt compounded by loss, a wound that had never been allowed to heal properly. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "You were providing for your family, doing what fathers and husbands do. You couldn't have known, could I not?" Benjamin looked at her then, his eyes haunted. There'd been talk of trouble in the area, drifters, men who might have been looking for easy targets. But I went anyway because the money was good and I thought... He shook his head. "I thought I was building something for them. Instead, I lost everything." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of his revelation settling between them. Outside, a meadowlark called from the cottonwood. Trees, its song sweet and clear in the afternoon air. The sound seemed to pull Benjamin back from the dark place his memories had taken him. "I've never told anyone that story," he said finally. "About what really happened, I mean. People back home, they knew Sarah and Jacob died in a fire. But they didn't know I blamed myself. Easier to let them think I was just a grieving man who took to drinking and drifting than to admit I was a coward who ran from the ashes of his own failure." "You're not a coward," Abigail said with quiet conviction. "A coward wouldn't carry that guilt so honestly. A coward wouldn't work so hard to build something good from the ruins. You're here, Benjamin, trying to make an honest life. That takes a courage." He studied her face as if trying to determine whether she truly meant what she said. Whatever he saw, there seemed to ease something in him, because his shoulders relaxed slightly, and the rigid set of his jaw softened. "I kept the horse with me all this time," he admitted. "Couldn't bear to leave it behind, but couldn't bear to look at it either. Must have fell out of my saddlebags when I was arranging my things in the back room." "Maybe it was meant to be found here," Abigail suggested gently. "Maybe Jacob would like knowing his toy was helping his father remember that love doesn't die, even when the people we love do." Benjamin looked down at the little horse again, but this time his expression held less pain and more tenderness. He would have liked this place, would have loved helping with the work, getting his hands dirty fixing things. Sarah used to say he got that from me, the need to build and repair and make things better than we found them. "Tell me about her," Abigail said. "About Sarah." For the next hour, as they took a break from the day's work, Benjamin shared memories of his wife. Sarah, who could make biscuits so light they seemed to float off the plate. Sarah, who sang while she worked and always found something to laugh about, even on the hardest days. Sarah, who'd seen past his size and quiet nature to the man underneath, who'd believed in his dreams and supported his ambitions. As he talked, Abigail found herself both honored by his trust and acutely aware of the comparison she must make in his mind. Sarah had been young and vibrant, a true partner in building a life from nothing. What was she by comparison? A spinster schoolteacher who'd spent her savings on a broken man's contract, more out of loneliness than any grand plan. But as the afternoon wore on, and they returned to their work, Benjamin replacing rotted floorboards while Abigail cleaned and organized the kitchen area, she began to understand something important. Benjamin wasn't looking for someone to replace Sarah. He was looking for a reason to keep building, to keep believing that the future could hold something better than the past. When it came time to leave for the day, Benjamin carefully placed the wooden horse on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, positioning it so it caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the western window. "Feels right having Jacob here," he said simply. "Like he's part of what we're building now." The word "we" sent a warmth through Abigail's chest that had nothing to do with the physical work they'd accomplished. Somehow, without either of them planning it, this had become more than a business arrangement. It had become a partnership in healing, his grief and her loneliness slowly transforming into something that looked remarkably like hope. The November morning brought the first real frost of the season, painting the windows of the homestead with delicate crystal patterns. Abigail arrived earlier than usual, her breath visible in small puffs as she climbed down from her wagon. She'd Been coming out every day now, sometimes bringing her teaching materials to grade papers while Benjamin worked, other times rolling up her sleeves to help with tasks that required 2 pairs of hands. The transformation of the property was remarkable. The barn stood straight and strong, its new roof gleaming in the pale sunlight. The house foundation had been reinforced and leveled, and Benjamin had replaced most of the broken windows with glass panes ordered from the catalogue. What had once been a monument to neglect was becoming a home again. She found Benjamin in the main room, kneeling by the fireplace where a small fire crackled cheerfully. In his hands was a faded photograph, the edges worn soft from handling. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck again by how the weeks of honest work had changed him. The haunted look was still there, but it no longer dominated his features. There was peace in his face now, and something that might have been contentment. "Morning, Abigail," he said, and she felt the same small thrill she experienced every time he used her given name. The formality between them had gradually dissolved as they worked side by side, replaced by something warmer and more intimate. "You're up early," she observed, hanging her coat on the peg he'd installed by the door. "And you have a fire going already. It's quite cozy." Benjamin rose to his feet, the photograph still in his hand. "Couldn't sleep. Sometimes the quiet gets too loud. If you take my meaning, figured I might as well make myself useful." Abigail understood exactly what he meant. She'd experienced those same restless hours when silence pressed against her thoughts and memories rose unbidden. "What's that you're holding?" For a moment, she thought he might deflect or change the subject as he had in their early days together. Instead, he moved closer and held out the photograph. "Sarah and Jacob. It's the only picture I have of them together." Abigail took the photograph with careful hands, studying the faces that had meant everything to Benjamin. Sarah was indeed beautiful, dark-haired and laughing, with eyes that sparkled even in the sepia tones of the image. Jacob was a miniature version of his father, all knees and elbows and gap-toothed grin, but with his mother's animated expression. "They look happy," she said softly. "Really, genuinely happy." They were. Sarah had this way of finding joy in the smallest things. A bird building its nest outside the kitchen window. Jacob's first successful attempt at printing his name. The way the light fell across our table at supper time. She made ordinary moments feel special. There was no bitterness in his voice as he spoke of his wife, only love and fond remembrance. Abigail felt a complex mix of emotions. Admiration for Sarah, gratitude that Benjamin felt comfortable sharing these memories with her, and a small, guilty pang of something that might have been envy. "She was lucky to have you," Abigail said, handing the photograph back to him. "And Jacob was lucky to have you both." Benjamin studied the image for a long moment before carefully tucking it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. "I used to think I was the lucky one. Sarah could have married anyone. She was that beautiful, that full of life. But she chose me. Said she loved that I was steady, that I thought before I spoke, that I built things to last." He paused, looking around the room they'd been restoring together. "She'd like what we're doing here, I think. She always believed broken things could be made whole again." The word "we" hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had quite ready to examine. They'd been working together for over a month now, falling into routines that felt natural and comfortable. Benjamin would have coffee, ready when she arrived, and she'd bring fresh bread or leftover stew from her solitary suppers. They talked while they worked, about the property, about her students, about books they'd read and places they'd seen. But underneath the easy companionship, something else was growing. "Benjamin," Abigail began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling. "Yes?" She moved to the window, looking out at the land they'd been reclaiming together. "Do you ever think about what comes next? I mean, after the house is finished and the property is fully restored?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "I suppose that depends on you. I'll have worked off what you paid for my contract by spring. After that, he shrugged, I'll go where the work takes me, I reckon. The thought of him leaving, of returning to her solitary existence in town while he disappeared into the vast frontier, made Abigail's chest tighten with unexpected pain. When had this man become so important to her daily happiness? When had she started looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in her day? What if... She turned from the window to face him, her heart hammering with nervous courage. What if there was a reason to stay? Benjamin went very still, his pale blue eyes searching her face. Abigail, what are you saying? Before she could lose her nerve, she crossed the room to stand directly in front of him. At this distance, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, acutely aware of his size and strength and the way he was looking at her with such careful attention. I'm saying that this place, what we've built here together, it feels like more than just property restoration. It feels like, she struggled for the right words, like home, like the kind of life I'd given up hoping for. Benjamin's hand rose slowly to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. Abigail, you know what I am, what I've done, what I've lost. I don't want you making decisions based on pity or loneliness. Is that what you think this is? She covered his hand with both of hers, holding it against her face. Benjamin, I see you, not the man the town whispers about, not the tragic figure carrying guilt over things beyond his control. I see the man who reads scripture by candlelight and thinks deeply about what the words mean. I see the man who's gentle with injured animals and patient with my fumbling attempts to help with carpentry. I see the man who's helped me remember that I'm more than just a spinster schoolteacher marking time until death. His other hand came up to frame her face, and she could see the war being fought behind his eyes, hope battling with fear, love struggling against the certainty that he didn't deserve happiness. I care about you, she whispered, more than I thought I could care about anyone again, and I hope, you might feel the same. Instead of answering with words, Benjamin lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and questioning, and Abigail felt something inside her chest bloom like a flower finally receiving sunlight after a long winter. She'd been kissed before. Thomas had been an affectionate husband, but this was different. This kiss held the weight of shared grief and mutual understanding, of two damaged people finding unexpected completeness in each other. When they parted, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he admitted. After Sarah, I thought that part of me was buried with them. Maybe it was, Abigail said softly. Maybe this is something entirely new, something that belongs just to us. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the frost and promising a beautiful day. Inside the homestead they'd restored together, two lonely souls discovered that sometimes the most unexpected love affairs begin not with passion, but with the simple recognition of kindred spirits finding their way home. The weeks following their first kiss brought a sweet domesticity to their daily routine. Abigail found herself arriving at the homestead earlier each morning, sometimes bringing her teaching supplies so she could work on lesson plans while Benjamin tackled the remaining repairs. He would glance up from his work to watch her bent over her slate, writing out arithmetic problems or preparing reading passages, and she would catch him looking with an expression of such tender affection that it made her heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. On this particular December morning, she arrived to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a sturdy piece he'd built from salvaged barnwood, with her worn copy of McGuffey's Reader open before him. His massive hands looked almost comical, holding the delicate primer, but he was reading with obvious concentration, his lips moving slightly as he worked through a passage about the value of honest labor. Having trouble with the lesson, she teased, hanging her coat on its familiar peg. Benjamin looked up with a sheepish grin. Actually, I was thinking about that boy you mentioned, Tommy Patterson, the one who can't sit still long enough to learn his letters. Abigail moved to peer over his shoulder at the book, acutely aware of his warmth and the clean scent of soap and sawdust that clung to him. "What about Tommy?" "Well, I was reading this story about the carpenter's apprentice, and it got me thinking, what if Tommy learned his letters by carving them? Give him a piece of soft pine and a whittling knife. Let him feel the shape of each letter as he cuts it out. Might stick better than chalk on slate." The suggestion was both practical and insightful, showing Benjamin's growing understanding of how different minds learned. More than that, it revealed his genuine interest in her work and her students, something that touched Abigail deeply. "That's brilliant," she said, impulsively leaning down to kiss his temple. "I could bring some wood scraps from here, and you could show me how to prepare them properly." Benjamin's hand came up to catch hers, pulling her down until she was sitting sideways on his lap, the McGuffey reader forgotten between them. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd like being part of helping that boy learn." They stayed like that for several minutes, comfortable in their growing intimacy. Abigail had never imagined she could feel so at ease with a man's physical presence. Thomas had been gentle and loving, but their relationship had followed the prescribed patterns of courtship and marriage. This, sitting on Benjamin's lap in the morning sunlight, his arms loose around her waist, discussing her students and his ideas, felt natural in a way that surprised her with its rightness. "Abigail," Benjamin said eventually, his voice carrying a weight that made her look at him more closely. "People are starting to talk." She'd been expecting this conversation. The citizens of Bellwater were not blind, and their daily routine had not gone unnoticed. "What kind of talk?" "The kind you'd expect. Mrs. Fletcher made it her business to inform Sheriff Morrison that she'd seen us embracing through the window. Morrison felt obligated to mention it to me when I picked up supplies yesterday." Abigail felt heat creep up her neck. The idea of Mrs. Fletcher peering through windows like some disapproving spirit was mortifying, but more concerning was the potential damage to both their reputations. "What did Sheriff Morrison say?" "Nothing harsh. He's a good man, and he knows I've been working hard to make an honest life. But he warned me that some folks are getting stirred up about the propriety of our arrangement. A single woman and a hired man spending time alone together every day." Benjamin's jaw tightened. "They're saying things that aren't fit to repeat." "To a lady, let them talk," Abigail said with more conviction than she felt. "We've done nothing wrong, haven't we?" Benjamin's hands tightened slightly on her waist. "Because sitting here like this, wanting to hold you and kiss you and—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It doesn't feel wrong, but maybe that's the problem. Maybe I'm thinking with my heart instead of my head." Abigail studied his face, seeing the internal struggle playing out in his expression. She understood his concern, understood, too, that their situation was becoming untenable. In the eyes of the community, a teacher's reputation was everything, and hers was already stretched thin by her unconventional arrangement with Benjamin. "What are you suggesting?" she asked quietly. "Maybe I should finish the work and move on. Find employment somewhere else. Somewhere far enough away that folks here can forget about me and remember only that you're a respectable woman who deserves better than gossip and speculation." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. The thought of losing him now, when she just found the courage to open her heart again, was unbearable. But she could see the logic in his reasoning and the sacrifice he was prepared to make for her reputation. "And what about what I want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Benjamin's expression softened. "What do you want, Abigail?" She stood up from his lap and moved to the window, looking out at the land they'd reclaimed together. The property was nearly finished now, the house sound and weather-tight, the barn restored to full function, the fences repaired, and the well working perfectly. They'd built something beautiful here, something that represented far more than just restored buildings. "I want to stop living half a life," she said finally. "I want to stop being afraid of what people might say and start being brave enough to reach for happiness when it's offered." She turned back to face him, her decision crystallizing with each word. Benjamin Garrett, I want you to marry me." The silence that followed her proposal stretched long enough that she began to worry. She'd badly misjudged his feelings. Benjamin sat perfectly still, his face cycling through surprise, hope, and something that looked very much like fear. "Abigail, before you say it's impossible, hear me out," she interrupted, moving back to stand in front of him. "I know it's unconventional for a woman to propose marriage. I know people will talk regardless of what we do. But I also know that I've been happier these past 2 months than I've been since Thomas died. I know that when I think about my future, I can't imagine it without you in it." Benjamin rose from his chair, towering over her but somehow managing not to seem intimidating. "You don't understand what you'd be taking on. The whispers will follow us wherever we go, and my past, there are things about my past that might catch up with us someday. Then we'll face them together." She reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Benjamin, I'm 41 years old. I've been alone for 7 years, and I was starting to believe that loneliness was my permanent condition, but you've shown me that it's possible to build something new from broken pieces. This house, this land, ourselves. We've already proven we can work together, create together, heal together. Marriage would just be making official what we've already become." Benjamin closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. When he opened them, again, she saw the exact moment his careful resistance crumbled. "Are you certain, really certain? Because once I say yes, once I allow myself to believe this is possible—" "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm certain." He kissed her then, deeper and more urgent than their first tentative embrace, and Abigail tasted the salt of tears she hadn't realized he was shedding. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, Abigail Stone, I'll marry you, and I'll spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of your courage." Outside, the December wind rattled the windows of their restored home, but inside, 2 hearts that had given up on love discovered that sometimes the best things in life come disguised as the most impractical decisions. The wedding was planned for Christmas Eve, a small ceremony in the parlor of their restored homestead with only a few close friends as witnesses. Abigail had spent the past week in a flurry of preparation, sewing a simple but elegant dress from deep blue wool and arranging for Pastor Williams to perform the ceremony. Benjamin had thrown himself into finishing the last details of the house, installing crown molding in the main room, building a proper wardrobe for their bedroom, crafting a rocking chair from oak as his wedding gift to her. The morning of December 23rd dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow covering the ground like a pristine wedding dress. Abigail was in the schoolhouse, dismissing her students for their Christmas holiday, when she heard the sound of horses approaching at speed. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Morrison riding hard toward the school, his face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Behind him rode a stranger, a lean man with sharp features and clothes that marked him as someone from far outside their quiet community. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, suggesting he'd ridden long and hard to reach Bellwater. "Miss Stone," Sheriff Morrison called as he dismounted, "I need to speak with you about Benjamin Garrett." Something cold settled in Abigail's stomach. "What about Benjamin?" The stranger stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. When he unfolded it, Abigail found herself staring at a wanted poster bearing Benjamin's likeness. Younger, a cleaner shaven, but unmistakably him. The words across the top made her knees weak. "Wanted for murder, 500 reward, dead or alive." "Ma'am, my name is Dutch Henderson, bounty hunter out of Kansas Territory. This here poster's been circulating for near 3 years now. Your Benjamin Garrett is wanted for the brutal murder of his wife and child, along with 2 other folks who tried to help them, burned down half a town in the process." Abigail stared at the poster, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The man described in the crude print, a violent killer who'd murdered his own family, bore no resemblance to the gentle soul who'd held her so tenderly, who'd carved toys for his lost son, who'd wept over a faded photograph. "There's been a mistake," she said firmly. Benjamin would never. He loved his wife and son. He's grieved for them every day since they died in an accident. Henderson's laugh was harsh and without humor. Accident? Ma'am, I tracked this man across 4 states. I know what he'd done. Set fire to his own house with his family locked inside, then killed Tom Bradley and his wife when they tried to intervene. Took off into the night with whatever money he could grab, leaving 5 people dead behind him. That's impossible. But even as Abigail spoke the words, doubt began creeping into her mind. Benjamin's reluctance to discuss his past, his guilty references to not being home when his family died, the way he'd taken responsibility for their deaths. What if it hadn't been survivor's guilt? What if it had been actual guilt? Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable but resolved. Miss Stone, I've got to bring him in. This post is legal, and Henderson here has the authority to collect him. Where is he? At the homestead, Abigail answered automatically, then immediately regretted giving up Benjamin's location. But Sheriff, you know him. You've seen how he's worked, how he's conducted himself. Does this sound like the man who's been living quietly in our community for months? Sometimes killers lie low for a while, Henderson interjected. Sometimes they find themselves a respectable woman to hide behind, make themselves look legitimate. Wouldn't be the first time I've seen it. The implication that she'd been used, manipulated, hit Abigail like a slap. She thought of all their conversations, all the moments of tenderness and understanding. Had it all been performance? Had Benjamin seen her loneliness and vulnerability and decided she'd make perfect cover for a man on the run? I have to warn him, she said, moving toward the door. Henderson stepped into her path. Ma'am, I wouldn't advise that. Interfering with the law could make you an accessory. And if this man is as dangerous as I believe, he's not dangerous, Abigail insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. 3 months ago, she wouldn't have believed a man of Benjamin's size could be gentle. What else about him might she have? Gotten wrong. Sheriff Morrison looked pained. Miss Stone, I'm going to have to insist you come with us, for your own protection and to help ensure this goes peacefully. If Benjamin sees you there, he might be more inclined to surrender without trouble. The ride to the homestead passed in a blur of churning thoughts and growing dread. Abigail found herself replaying every conversation she'd had with Benjamin, searching for signs she might have missed. His careful evasion when discussing his past, his self-recrimination over his family's death, his sometimes haunted expression when he thought she wasn't looking. Did it all point to guilt over crimes rather than simple grief? But then she remembered his hands on hers as they'd worked side by side, his gentle way with injured animals, the reverent care with which he'd handled his worn Bible. How could those same hands have committed murder? They found Benjamin in the barn, currying one of the horses he'd purchased to work the small ranch they'd planned to operate together. He looked up as they approached, and Abigail saw the exact moment he recognized what was happening. His face went very still, and something died behind his eyes. Miss Stone, he said quietly, setting down the brush. Sheriff, I reckon this has been a long time coming. Henderson stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. Benjamin Garrett, you're under arrest for the murders of Sarah Garrett, Jacob. Garrett, Tom Bradley and Mary Bradley. You're going to come with us, nice and peaceful. The murders? Abigail's voice cracked on the word. Benjamin, tell them this is wrong. And tell them you didn't. Benjamin looked at her then, and what she saw in his face shattered something inside her chest. Not denial, not outrage, not even surprise, just a deep, weary acceptance. I can't tell you that, Abigail, he said softly, because it wouldn't be true. The words hit her like physical blows. She actually staggered backward, Sheriff Morrison reaching out to steady her. What are you saying? I'm saying I killed them. Benjamin's voice was hollow, emotionless. I killed my wife and my son and 2 good people who tried to help them. I set the fire that burned down half of Cedar Ridge. I'm exactly what this poster. He says I am. Henderson's hand tightened on his gun. So you confess? I confess. Benjamin raised his hand slowly. But there's more to the story than what's written on that paper. Always is, Henderson said cynically. Save it for the judge. As Sheriff Morrison moved forward with shackles, Abigail found her voice. More to the story how? Benjamin, if you did this, why? Why would you hurt them? Benjamin's gaze met hers across the barn, and she saw anguish there that went deeper than any well. Because I was drunk. Because I was angry. Because I came home from that cattle drive to find Sarah had been seeing another man while I was gone. Found them together in my own bed, in the house I'd built for her with my own hands. The confession continued to pour out of him, each word another nail in the coffin of everything Abigail had believed about him. I went crazy with the rage of it. Started drinking, started shouting, started throwing things around. Sarah was screaming at me, Jacob was crying, and I lost control completely. Grabbed a lantern and smashed it against the wall, thinking, to scare them, to make them understand what they'd done to me. But the fire spread faster than you expected, Henderson said, his tone suggesting he'd heard similar stories before. The whole room went up in seconds. Sarah and Jacob were trapped in the back bedroom. The Bradley couple lived next door. They came running when they saw the flames. I tried to stop them from going in, tried to tell them it was too dangerous. But they wouldn't listen. None of us made it out. Except you, Abigail said, her voice barely above a whisper. Except me. Benjamin's shoulders sagged. I got out through a window, burned but alive, and watched everyone I'd ever loved die because of my jealousy and my pride and my damned quick temper. Henderson nodded with satisfaction. Like I said, ma'am, sometimes men lie real good to the women who trust them. As Sheriff Morrison secured the shackles around Benjamin's wrists, Abigail felt her world collapsing around her. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd built her hopes on, had been an illusion. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd planned to marry in less than 24 hours, was a murderer who'd been lying to her from the moment they met. Abigail, Benjamin said as they prepared to lead him away, I want you to know what I felt for you was real. Everything else was lies, but that was true. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since Sheriff Morrison had shown her the wanted poster, she saw not the gentle giant she'd fallen in love with, but a stranger wearing his face. A man capable of violence, capable of destroying the people he claimed to love most. Don't, she said, her voice sharp with betrayal and pain. Don't you dare try to make this about love. You used me. You let me fall for you. Let me plan a future. With you, knowing all the time what you really were. Benjamin flinched as if she'd struck him, but he didn't deny her accusation. How could he? The evidence was right there on the wanted poster, confirmed by his own confession. As they led him away toward town and the jail that would hold him until transport could be arranged, Abigail remained in the barn, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work and shattered dreams. The rocking chair he'd been building for her as a wedding gift sat half-finished in the corner, a mocking reminder of the future that would never be. Tomorrow was supposed to be Christmas Eve, the day she'd planned to become Mrs. Benjamin Garrett. Instead, she would spend it alone, trying to figure out how to rebuild her life from the ashes of the most catastrophic mistake she'd ever made. Christmas Eve morning arrived grey and bitter, with heavy clouds promising snow before nightfall. Abigail had spent the night sleepless in her empty house in town, staring at the blue wool dress she'd sewn for her wedding, now hanging like a ghost of abandoned dreams. The events of the previous day felt surreal. Surely she couldn't have discovered that the man she loved was a murderer, that everything she'd believed about him had been a lie. But the wanted poster lay on her kitchen table like damning evidence. Benjamin's younger face staring back at her above the terrible words that described his crimes. She'd read it so many times during the long night that she'd memorized every detail. The reward money, the description of his size and appearance, the cold facts of what he'd done to his family. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. She opened it to find Dr. Henley standing on her porch, his weathered face creased with concern and something that looked like excitement. Miss Stone, I need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development regarding Benjamin Garrett. Abigail stepped aside to let him enter, her heart hammering with a mixture of dread and hope she was afraid to acknowledge. What kind of development? The elderly physician pulled a folded telegram from his coat pocket. I've been thinking about this business all night, and something didn't sit right with me, so I sent some inquiries of my own to Kansas City and beyond. He unfolded the telegram with hands that trembled slightly. This came back an hour ago. Abigail took the yellow paper and read the message that would change everything. Benjamin Garrett, case closed. Stop real perpetrator Marcus Pike, apprehended and executed Colorado Territory. 1873. Stop. Pike confessed to using Garrett identity. Avoid. Capture. Stop. Advise extreme caution with bounty hunters. Stop. She read it twice, then looked up at Dr. Henley with tears in her eyes. He's innocent. Benjamin is innocent of murder. More than innocent, Dr. Henley said grimly. He's been carrying guilt for crimes committed by another man entirely. That explains why his confession yesterday didn't match the details on the wanted poster. He was confessing to a tragic accident while being accused of deliberate murder. Before Abigail could fully process this revelation, another knock came at her door. This time it was young Timothy Patterson, his face flushed with cold and urgency. Miss Stone, Dr. Henley, you need to come quick. There's trouble at the homestead. What kind of trouble, Timothy? Dr. Henley asked, already reaching for his coat. Men with guns, sir. 4 of them, including that bounty hunter fellow. They've got the place surrounded, and we could hear shouting from half a mile away. Pa sent me to get the sheriff, but he's out at the Morrison Ranch dealing with rustlers. Abigail felt ice form in her veins. Benjamin's still in jail. No, ma'am, Timothy interrupted. Sheriff let him out about an hour ago when this telegram came in. Said he was going to ride out to the homestead to think things through. Dr. Henley and Abigail exchanged looks of growing alarm. If Benjamin was at the homestead and Henderson, or whoever he really was, had arrived with armed men, the situation was about to turn deadly. Timothy, ride as fast as you can to the Morrison Ranch and tell Sheriff Morrison what's happening, Dr. Henley instructed. Tell him to bring deputies if he can find them. As the boy rode off, Abigail was already moving toward her coat and boots. Dr. Henley, I have to get out there. Absolutely not. This is a job for lawmen, not what? Not a woman who might be the only person who can prevent bloodshed? Abigail's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. Benjamin has been torturing himself for 3 years over crimes he didn't commit. If he thinks he's about to be arrested again for murder, he might do something desperate. And if Henderson is really after something else entirely... She stopped, a terrible possibility occurring to her. Dr. Henley, what if this was never about the bounty? What if Henderson has been watching our property for other reasons? The elderly physician's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The money you spent on Benjamin's contract, the supplies you've been buying, the improvements to the property. To an outsider, it might look like you have substantial resources hidden. There, exactly. And with Benjamin in jail, I would have been alone and vulnerable. Abigail checked the loads in Thomas's old pistol, a skill she'd maintained despite years of peaceful living. Henderson gets Benjamin out of the way with false charges, then moves in to rob what he thinks is an easy target. They rode hard toward the homestead, taking the back trail that would bring them to the property from the wooded side. As they crested the hill that overlooked the land Abigail and Benjamin had worked so hard to restore, the scene below confirmed their worst fears. Homestead was under siege. 4 men on horseback had positioned themselves around the buildings, while smoke rose from what appeared to be a fire near the barn. Benjamin's horse was tethered outside the main house, which meant he was inside, trapped or making a stand. There, Dr. Henley said grimly, pointing to a figure crouched behind the woodpile they'd stacked for winter. That's Benjamin. He's pinned down. Even from a distance, Abigail could see the glint of metal in Benjamin's hands. He'd retrieved his gun belt, The one he'd worn when he first arrived in Bellwater. The one that marked him as a man who'd lived by violence before learning to live by peace. The sight filled her with both relief and dread. Benjamin was armed and able to defend himself, but against 4 men, his chances were poor. "What's that they're shouting?" Dr. Henley asked, straining to hear the voices carrying across the winter. Ere Abigail listened intently and made out Henderson's voice. "Garrett, we know the woman's got money hidden in there. Tell us where it is and we'll make this quick." "So much for the bounty hunter story," she muttered. "This is robbery, pure and simple." Benjamin's reply came clearly across the distance. "There's no money here. Miss Stone spent what she had fixing this place up." Henderson's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Nobody spends $100 on a hired man unless they've got plenty more where that came from. We'll tear this place apart board by board if we have to. That threat, the promise to destroy everything she and Benjamin had built together, ignited something fierce in Abigail's chest. These men had already stolen months of happiness from Benjamin with their false accusations. They would not be allowed to destroy the home they'd created together. "Dr. Henley, I need you to work your way around to the east side of the property," she said, checking her pistol one more time. "When you're in position, create some kind of distraction. Make noise, shout about the sheriff coming, anything to draw their attention. What are you planning to do?" Something that would probably horrify you if you knew the details. She gathered her reins, preparing to ride down the hill. "Just trust me, and be ready to help Benjamin when the shooting starts." "Abigail, this is madness. You're not a gunfighter." "No," she agreed, "but I'm a woman defending her home and the men she loves. Sometimes that's more dangerous than any gunfighter." She spurred her horse down the slope, riding directly toward the homestead with the reckless courage of someone who had finally found something worth risking everything to protect. Behind her, Dr. Henley shook his head and began working his way through the trees toward his assigned position, muttering prayers under his breath. At the bottom of the hill, Abigail dismounted and made her way on foot toward the house, using the restored outbuildings as cover. The familiarity of the property worked in her favor. She knew every fence post, every tree, every approach that would keep her hidden from watching eyes. She could hear Henderson's men growing more impatient, their shouts to Benjamin becoming more threatening. One of them had set fire to the hay they'd stored for winter feed, and the smoke was making it difficult for Benjamin to see clearly. They were trying to force him out of his defensive position, make him choose between surrender and being burned out. As Abigail reached the back wall of the house, she heard the most chilling sound yet, the distinctive creak of the porch steps as someone approached the front door. Henderson was making his move, and Benjamin was about to be caught between the fire behind him and armed men in front. Through the window, she could see Benjamin crouched near the fireplace, his gun trained on the front door. His face was set with grim determination, but she could also see the weight of his situation in his expression. He was prepared to fight, but he wasn't prepared to win, not against these odds. That was about to change. Abigail made her way to the back door, the entrance to what had once been the hired man's quarters where Benjamin had lived during their first weeks together. The door was unlocked, as it had been since the day they'd decided there were no longer any barriers between them. Inside, she moved quickly through the familiar rooms toward the front of the house, where Benjamin waited for what he surely believed would be his final confrontation. The wooden floors she'd helped him restore no longer creaked, another advantage of all their careful work together. She reached the main room just as Henderson's voice came through the front door. "Last chance. Garrett, throw out your gun and tell us where the money is, or we're coming in shooting." Benjamin's knuckles were white where he gripped his weapon, but his voice was steady when he replied, "There's no money to find, and I'm not throwing down my gun. If you want to come in, come ahead. But understand that the first man through that door won't be going back out." It was then that Abigail stepped up beside him, Thomas's old rifle in her hands, and said quietly, "The first man, maybe, but not the second, third, and fourth." Benjamin's head whipped around in shock. "Abigail!" "What in God's name are you doing here?" "Fighting for our home," she said simply. "Together." The brass school bell that Abigail had brought from town months ago now hung from the porch of their restored homestead, its clear tone cutting through the December air as she rang it frantically. Benjamin had insisted on installing it there, saying every home needed a way to call for help or announce important news. Now as Sheriff Morrison, Benjamin and Dr. Henley rode hard toward the sound, that bell was serving its most crucial purpose. They crested the hill overlooking the property to find a scene that made Benjamin's blood run cold. Henderson, or Cyrus, Webb, as they now knew him, had not come alone. 3 rough-looking men on horseback surrounded the homestead, while Webb himself stood on the porch, his gun drawn and pointed toward the window where Abigail's silhouette was visible. "How did she get out there before us?" Dr. Henley gasped, reining in his horse. "Must have taken the back trail when she heard the shots," Sheriff Morrison replied grimly. "Probably thought Webb was threatening the property in our absence." Benjamin's hands tightened on the reins of the horse Morrison had provided him. The familiar weight of his gun belt around his waist felt strange after months of peaceful labor. But seeing Abigail in danger awakened something fierce and protective in his chest. For the first time since the fire that had taken his family, he felt the cold clarity of purpose that had once made him a man to be reckoned with. "Sheriff, those men with Webb, they're not lawmen," Benjamin observed, studying the group below. "Look at their horses, their gear. Those are saddle tramps, probably promised a cut of whatever Webb thinks he'll find here." "What could he possibly want from your property?" Dr. Henley asked. Benjamin's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "He thinks Abigail's got money hidden there. Remember, she paid $100 cash for my contract. That's more than most folks in Bellwater see. In 6 months. He probably figures if she can spend that much on a whim, she's got plenty more stashed away." The sound of the school bell ceased, replaced by Webb's voice carrying clearly across the winter air. "Miss Stone, I know you're in there. I also know you've got money hidden somewhere on this property. Make this easy on yourself and show me where it is." Abigail's voice came from inside the house, steady despite the circumstances. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no money here." "Don't play games with me, lady. Nobody spends $100 on a hired man unless they've got plenty more where that came from. I've been watching this place for weeks, and I know you've been buying supplies, paying workers, fixing this place up. That takes real money." "The money I had is all spent," Abigail called back. "Every penny went into restoring this property." Webb's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "We'll see about that. Boys, start with the barn. Tear it apart if you have to." As 2 of Webb's men dismounted and headed toward the barn Benjamin had painstakingly restored, something dangerous shifted in the big man's expression. This wasn't just about robbery anymore. It was about the destruction of everything he and Abigail had built together. "Sheriff," Benjamin said quietly, "I need you to understand something. I spent 3 years running from what I thought was justice, letting guilt eat at me from the inside. I won't spend another day watching that woman suffer for my mistakes." Morrison looked at him with concern. "Benjamin, I know you want to help, but you're not a lawman. This needs to be handled legal and proper. Legal and proper is what put me in that jail cell yesterday based on a false wanted poster," Benjamin interrupted. "Sometimes a man has to decide what's right, regardless of what's legal." Before either Morrison or Dr. Henley could stop him, Benjamin spurred his horse forward, riding down the hill toward the homestead with the fearless determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "Benjamin Garrett," Webb shouted as the big man approached. "I heard they arrested you yesterday. How'd you get loose?" Benjamin reined in his horse about 30 yards from the porch, well within gun range, but far enough to avoid being an easy target. "Turned out that wanted poster of yours was fake, Webb. Funny thing about that, almost like someone wanted me out of the way for reasons that had nothing to do with justice." Webb's face darkened, but his gun remained trained on the house. "I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. You're Cyrus Webb, the man who bid against Miss Stone at my auction. When she outbid you, you decided to find another way to get what you wanted. Only problem is, you picked the wrong people to cross. The two men who'd been heading toward the barn stopped and turned back toward the confrontation, their hands moving, instinctively toward their weapons. The third rider, still mounted, positioned himself to have a clear shot at Benjamin. "You're making a mistake, Garrett," Webb called out. "Ride away now, and nobody has to get hurt. This doesn't concern you anymore." "Everything about this place concerns me," Benjamin replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute conviction. "Miss Stone is going to be my wife. That makes this my home, and you're not welcome here." Inside the house, Abigail's heart nearly stopped at Benjamin's words. Despite everything that had happened, despite the lies and revelations and broken trust, he was still claiming her as his own, still willing to put himself in danger to protect what they'd built together. Webb's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Last chance, Garrett. There's 4 of us and 1 of you. Even if you're fast, you can't take us all." Benjamin's hand moved to rest casually on his gun butt, a gesture that was somehow more threatening than any dramatic draw could have been. You might be surprised what a man can do when he's got something worth dying for. The tension stretched. Taut as a violin string, 4 armed men facing off, while the woman they were fighting over remained trapped inside the house that had become both sanctuary and potential tomb. The standoff might have lasted longer if not for the small silver locket that slipped from Webb's coat pocket as he shifted his position on the porch. It hit the wooden boards with a delicate chime, and Abigail's sharp intake of breath from inside. The house told Benjamin everything he needed to know. "That locket!" Abigail called out, her voice filled with recognition and growing anger. "Where did you get that locket?" Webb glanced down at the piece of jewelry, his momentary distraction exactly what Benjamin had been waiting for. But it was Abigail's next words that changed everything. "That belonged to Sarah Garrett. I saw it in the photograph Benjamin showed me. It has pictures of her and Jacob inside." The locket, Benjamin's most precious keepsake of his dead family, the one thing he'd treasured above all else, lay glittering in the winter sunlight like an accusation. He'd kept it in his saddlebags, along with the wooden horse and the faded photograph, never imagining that someone would violate even that sacred space. "You went through my things," Benjamin said, his voice deadly quiet. "You took that from my belongings while I was in jail." Webb's face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "Pretty little bauble. Figured it might be worth something, seeing as how you won't be needing it where you're going." The casual desecration of his family's memory was more than Benjamin could bear. 3 years of guilt and grief and self-imposed exile crystallized into pure, focused rage. But this wasn't the blind fury that had led to the fire that killed Sarah and Jacob. This was the controlled anger of a man who had finally learned the difference between justice and vengeance. "Pick it up," Benjamin said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "What?" "The locket. Pick it up and set it on the porch rail where Miss Stone can reach it. Then step away from the house." Webb laughed, but there was a nervous edge to the sound. "I don't think so, Garrett. You're in no position to make demands." "Actually, I think he is." The new voice came from behind Webb's men, and everyone turned to see Sheriff Morrison and Dr. Henley approaching from the far side of the property, having circled around while Benjamin held their attention. Morrison's rifle was trained on the mounted gunman, while Dr. Henley, armed with an old cavalry pistol, covered the 2 men near the barn. "Sheriff Morrison," Webb called out, trying to regain control of the situation. "Perfect timing. This man is resisting arrest for murder." "Funny thing about that," Morrison replied conversationally. "I got another telegram this morning. Seems the real Dutch Henderson, the actual bounty hunter you've been impersonating, died of cholera 6 months ago in Colorado. Makes your credentials a bit suspect." The mounted gunman's horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension in his rider. "Webb, you didn't say nothing about tangling with the law. I signed on for a simple robbery, not a shooting war with the sheriff." "Shut up, Collins," Webb snapped. But Benjamin could see the situation slipping away from him. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Turns out Cyrus Webb, that would be you, is wanted for confidence schemes and robbery across 3 territories. The real crime here isn't murder, it's fraud and attempted theft." Webb's grip on his gun tightened, his eyes darting between Benjamin, the sheriff, and the house where Abigail remained trapped. "Maybe so, but I've still got the woman, and you've still got a choice to make. Back off, or she gets hurt." "No," Abigail said firmly from inside the house. "She doesn't." The front door swung open, and Abigail stepped onto the porch with Benjamin's old hunting rifle in her hands, the same weapon he'd used to put meat on their table during the lean weeks when they were getting the property established. She'd positioned herself behind Webb, the rifle barrel inches from his back. "You made one mistake, Mr. Webb," she said calmly. "You assumed I was helpless. But I've been living on the frontier for 20 years, and any woman who can't handle a rifle doesn't last long out here." Webb started to turn, but Abigail's voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't. This rifle is loaded, and I've been hunting game since I was 12 years old. From this distance, I couldn't miss if I tried." The tableau held for a moment. Webb trapped between Abigail's rifle and Benjamin's steady gaze. His men covered by the sheriff and Dr. Henley, the locket gleaming on the porch boards like a symbol of all the precious things that had been violated and would now be restored. "It's over, Webb," Benjamin said quietly. "Drop your weapon." For a heartbeat, Webb looked like he might try to fight his way out. But surrounded and outgunned, faced with the unified determination of people who had found something worth protecting, his shoulders sagged in defeat. The gun clattered onto the porch boards beside Sarah's locket. "Collins, Murphy, throw down your weapons," Sheriff Morrison ordered. "You're all under arrest." As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Benjamin walked slowly to the porch and picked up the silver locket. He opened it carefully, revealing the tiny photographs of Sarah and Jacob that had sustained him through 3 years of wandering and guilt. "I'm sorry," Abigail said softly, lowering the rifle. "I'm sorry they violated even this." Benjamin looked at her, this remarkable woman who had risked everything to save him, who had faced down armed men to protect what they'd built together, and felt the last of his guilt finally beginning to lift. "They didn't violate anything that matters," he said. "The memory lives here." He touched his chest over his heart. "Not in things that can be stolen. Sarah and Jacob will always be part of me, but they don't have to be all of me anymore." The locket caught the afternoon sunlight as he gently closed it, its contents safe once more. Around them, Sheriff Morrison was securing the prisoners, but Benjamin only had eyes for Abigail, the woman who had saved him in more ways than he could. Count, who had shown him that love could exist alongside loss, that the future didn't have to be held hostage by the past. 6 months later, on a warm June morning, Abigail stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Benjamin through the window as he worked in the garden behind their homestead. The simple gold band on her left hand caught the early sunlight. Not the elaborate ring Thomas had given her, but something new, something that belonged entirely to this life they'd built together from broken pieces. They had married on New Year's Day, exactly 1 week after the confrontation with Webb and his men. Pastor Williams had performed the ceremony in the main room of their restored home, with half the town of Bellwater in attendance. The community that had once whispered about their unconventional arrangement now spoke of them with respect and even admiration. There was something to be said for a man who would face down 4 armed criminals to protect his woman, and something to be said for a woman who would aim a rifle at a man's back to save the one she loved. The new wedding rings, matching bands of plain gold that Benjamin had ordered from Kansas City, represented everything the old ring could not. Where Thomas's ring had been given in youth and inexperience, when love was untested by real hardship, these rings had been forged in the fires of loss and doubt and hard-won trust. They were promises made not in the blindness of first love, but in the clear-eyed certainty of 2 people who had seen each other at their worst, and chosen to stay. "Good morning, Mrs. Garrett," Benjamin called from the garden, straightening up from where he'd been tending the tomatoes. The formal address was a small joke between them. He used it whenever he wanted to make her smile, reminding them both of how far they'd come from the careful politeness of their early days. "Good morning, Mr. Garrett," she replied, stepping onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. "The plants are looking strong this year." "They should be. We gave them good soil to grow in." He accepted the coffee and pulled her close with his free arm, both of them understanding that he wasn't just talking about vegetables. The past 6 months had been a time of healing and growth for both of them. Benjamin had gradually stopped, carrying the crushing weight of guilt over his family's death, helped by several long conversations with Pastor Williams and the gradual acceptance that tragedy was not the same as sin. He still missed Sarah and Jacob, would always miss them, but their memory no longer defined the boundaries of his world. For Abigail, marriage to Benjamin had brought a completeness she'd never known, even in her first marriage, where Thomas had been gentle and sweet, but ultimately fragile. Benjamin was solid as bedrock, tested by hardship and emerged stronger. She felt safe with him in ways that went beyond physical protection, safe to be herself, to speak her mind, to dream about futures that stretched far beyond the next day's lessons. "I have news," she said, setting down her coffee cup and turning to face him fully. Benjamin's expression grew attentive. Over the months, he'd learned to read her moods and expressions with the accuracy of a man who paid close attention to the things he treasured. "Good news, or concerning news. That depends on how you feel about sharing our home with someone new." For a moment, Benjamin's face went blank with surprise, then lit up with understanding and joy. "Abigail, are you—" "I am." She took his hands and placed them gently on her still flat stomach. "Dr. Henley confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby." Benjamin's knees actually buckled, and he sat down hard on the porch steps, pulling her with him. His hands remained on her waist, protective and wondering, as if he could hardly believe this miracle was real. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I thought, after losing Jacob, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I never imagined I'd get another chance to be a father." They sat together in the morning sunlight, surrounded by the garden they'd planted and tended, the house they'd restored board by board, the life they'd built from the ashes of their separate losses. The baby growing inside Abigail was not a replacement for the children they'd lost. Nothing could ever replace Jacob or the babies she and Thomas had never been able to have, but it was a promise that the future could hold joy as well as sorrow. New beginnings as well as endings. "What do you think they'll say in town?" Abigail asked, though she was learning not to care quite so much about the opinions of others. "They'll say we're blessed," Benjamin replied with certainty, "because we are." Over the following weeks, as word of Abigail's pregnancy spread through Bellwater, the community that had once viewed them with suspicion embraced them fully. Mrs. Fletcher, who had been among their harshest critics, showed up at their door with a basket of baby clothes she'd sewn herself. Dr. Henley made regular visits, fussing over Abigail's health with the devotion of a man who delivered half the babies in the territory. Even Sheriff Morrison stopped by regularly, bringing news from town and updates on the legal proceedings against Webb and his associates. The homestead continued to flourish under their joint care. They'd added chickens and a milk cow, expanded the garden, and built a proper workshop where Benjamin could pursue the woodworking that had become his passion. He'd completed the rocking chair he'd started as her wedding gift, and it now sat in their bedroom, waiting for the child who would soon fill their home with new life. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their restored porch and watch the sun set over the land they'd reclaimed from neglect. Sometimes Benjamin would read aloud from his worn Bible or from books they'd ordered from back east. Sometimes Abigail would grade papers while he worked on small carpentry projects. But always, They were together, two people who had learned that the most unexpected packages often contain the greatest treasures. The little wooden horse Jacob had loved still sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder that love transcends death and that the past need not imprison the future. Soon it would be joined by new toys, new memories, new reasons to hope. And the silver locket with Sarah and Jacob's pictures remained in Benjamin's keeping, worn close to his heart on special occasions, not as a shrine to what was lost, but as a bridge between the love that had been and the love that was yet to come. In the distance, the school bell they'd hung on their porch caught the evening breeze and chimed softly, a sound that no longer called for help, but sang instead of peace found, home established, and love finally allowed to bloom in ground. Made fertile by shared sorrows and mutual healing,